Spotlight is proudly sponsored by HEC Media, St. Louis's home for arts, education, and culture.
Today on Spotlight, how the California School of the Deaf went from years of losing seasons to an extraordinary run of victories. And then SLU researchers hold a clinical trial to study injuries and how to prevent them. Plus, how football was a much different game when it started in the late 19th century. But first, reminisce with veteran broadcaster Bob Costas and find out the advice he has for young people. It's Sunday, and you're watching the multiple Emmy Award-winning Spotlight. Bob Costas, a legendary sportscaster known for his insightful commentary on events like the Olympics and NFL, has spent over 4 decades shaping sports broadcasting. He recently sat down with HEC to discuss his legendary career.
My name is Bob Costas, and I've been a broadcaster for almost 50 years now. Growing up in New York in the 1960s, I listened to Mel Allen and Red Barber, 2 great broadcasters on the Yankee games. Everyone at one time or another listened to Vin Scully, the most literate of baseball broadcasters. I like Jack Whitaker because he was an essayist, and you don't have much of that on network TV sports. You know, I could never separate the announcers' voices from the events, especially the best of the announcers. They were the soundtrack of it. And while I played sports as a kid, I knew I wasn't going to wind up playing professionally or getting a college scholarship. So if I was going to stay close to sports and be part of it, then I would have to try and be a broadcaster or a sports writer. And I went to Syracuse University because they already had a reputation as an excellent journalism school and communications school. And that turned out to be a big advantage for me. When I was a teenager and in college, the legendary announcer was Marv Albert, and just about everybody at Syracuse calling games on the campus station was using some of Marv's expressions, and whether they knew it or not, they were copying Marv's rhythm and pace. I think when you start out, inevitably you're going to be copying people who you admire, but eventually, if you're any good at all, you'll develop your own style. You have to go with something that's true to you, or else you won't be very good at all. My first job was broadcasting minor league hockey in Syracuse. And then from there, I was lucky enough to land a job at KMOX in St. Louis. Only a couple of years after I got there, CBS TV began using me on small regional games during the football and basketball season. By 1980, NBC had hired me to do NFL games and a few other assignments for them, and I wound up at NBC for nearly 40 years. I also was able to work at HBO, and when the baseball network came into existence in 2009, I signed with them. In the days leading up to the game, you're paying attention to the 2 teams involved that you're going to call. You're watching as much as you can. It's easier to do on the internet than it was for much of my career. You're trying to digest as much information and insight about each of the teams and the circumstances in the league, the story of their season. And now there's so much information that part of your job is to act as an editor and to say, wait a minute, yeah, all of this stuff is factual, but which of it is interesting and pertinent and makes a larger point, as opposed to just being information that is neither interesting nor particularly essential. And then usually the day before and the day of the game, you're meeting with the managers and you get some insight. You talk to those who have covered the team on a regular basis, the writers and broadcasters who are around the team, and then you go and you hope that you're well enough prepared and you take your chances when the red light comes on. I think a lot of people would tell you that the travel is the hardest part. At the beginning, the travel can be exciting. It takes you to places you otherwise would never go, brings you in contact with new experiences and new people. But the travel can also be tiring. And living out of a suitcase, sometimes the travel can wear you down. But one rule of thumb is that you want to get your foot in the door. You want to get your first job, even if it doesn't line up with what you ultimately hope to do. You want to build your resume. And I would also encourage any young person to read as much as possible. There's more and more material available than ever before, but a lot of that material that's on the internet is not terribly well expressed. It's not really thoughtful. If you read well-written newspaper and magazine articles, and if you actually read honest-to-God books, it isn't that you're going to plagiarize anything that's in there, but reading gives you a greater appreciation for language, for turns of phrase, for various ways to express yourself. The broader your vocabulary and the broader your frame of reference, not just about sports, but about the world, the more interesting and effective you'll be as a broadcaster.
For more St. Louis stories, subscribe to the HEC YouTube channel. Connect STL from HEC Media.
In the fall of 2021, while working as the San Francisco bureau chief for the New York Times, Thomas Fuller discovered the extraordinary story of the Cubs, a high school football team that was dominating their opponents on their way to a league championship. Now, you might think you've heard this story before, but there's a twist.
One day I got an email that said, hey, there's this team in Southern California. For 7 decades, they haven't done so well, but they're undefeated now. The team is at the California School for the Deaf in Riverside. And I said, I gotta go check this out. I got in my car and I drove down to Riverside, and it was Friday night. Watched them, really wallop their opponents, talked to the coach of the opposing team, who was really shaken by it. He was like, don't think that you have an advantage against this team because they're deaf. They communicate better than any team I've ever played against. And so I was hooked. I was hooked on the story.
Fuller was so hooked that he stepped away from his job at the Times to fully devote himself to follow the team on their journey throughout the season of 2022.
I spent the next season on the sidelines every day, watching their practices, going to their games, interviewing all the kids, all the coaches, and doing a deep dive into deafness. Is deafness an edge? Is it maybe not a disability? There are lots of things about deafness that make it an advantage on the football field. I found that really fascinating.
Fuller's debut book, The Boys of Riverside, a deaf football team and a quest for glory, explores these questions while following the struggles and triumphs of the players on the team.
The kids who are there now are from every imaginable background, from all over the globe. It's really like an American dream situation. And they come to the California School for the Deaf, and they're all using ASL, American Sign Language. It was this like deaf brotherhood. You want to read a great American underdog story, here you go.
Well, tell me a little bit about the book. You wrote about a high school football team from the United States.
It's 8-man ball, which is for small schools, for rural schools, for native schools, and it's a fast game, so you take out a couple linemen. It's, miss a tackle, and that might be a touchdown. It's intense, it's physical, and I loved watching it. So I looked into the science of it. I looked into the sociology of it, this idea that you have all these kids who never quite fit in when they played football on hearing teams when they were younger. You can imagine being a great athlete, hungry to play football, passionate about the game of football, but not being able to communicate with your own teammates. Then they come to the California School for the Deaf, and they're all, using ASL, American Sign Language, in a deaf brain. The brain pathways reformulate, and so people who are profoundly deaf have better vision, better eyesight, more acute eyesight than hearing people. They are essentially hearing with their eyes, and what better skill if you're playing football than to have, a vision of the field that is more acute, having peripheral vision that's better, having a detection of motion that is better. And a big part of what I looked into was how signing really helped the boys, the coaches, the team communicate in ways that confounded their hearing opponents.
Fuller reveals that the huddle in football was invented because of a deaf team. Hear that story and watch the full interview at hecmedia.org.
HEC Media. Recognized, celebrated, honored time and again for excellence in the industry. Find all of the award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
Small towns to big city communities. They rally behind their high school football teams. Under those Friday night lights, the energy on the field and in the stands runs high. It's high impact with a high risk for injuries.
Injury risk in football is very high. I mean, you talk about the top sports with the highest risk of injury. You talk about basketball, soccer, football, and a couple of other team sports. But football is like on top of the list.
And that risk of injury is substantial across youth sports.
Right now, we know from research that ACL injuries and ankle sprains are the top on the list. The joint injuries, very devastating injuries are on top of the list. We also have hamstring strains also on top of the list. So if you put those three together, I think that's a huge, huge problem. I mean, we can talk about the consequences of an ACL injury for the next 30 minutes. Not bad.
Dr. Olu Owaye is the director of the Translational Sports Injury Prevention Lab at St. Louis University.
All right, just keep it within a small circle.
SLU researchers say structured exercise-based interventions, such as neuromuscular training warm-up programs, can reduce injuries by about 60% across youth team sports, and they are underused by coaches.
The structured exercise warm-up programs actually outperforms traditional warm-up programs. That helps to train kids' muscles and nerves and the brain to communicate better.
He says that most middle and high school coaches don't know enough about injury prevention.
Understanding the sport and doing the right movements, having the right techniques, making sure they avoid the training errors, managing recovery.
He says current warm-up programs do not work to prevent injuries, but neuromuscular training warm-up programs can save an athlete from losing a season, a college scholarship, or from having lifelong problems.
On the best evidence for injury prevention in youth football, having the right warm-up, which we call neuromuscular training exercise, injury prevention warm-ups, before every practice sessions and every game sessions, possibly, to help prevent the injuries in football.
Dr. Olu Owaye is the project lead of a clinical trial that enrolled youth football coaches in Missouri. Study results with participating coaches, including high school and club football coaches, show promise. It's called the MAP for Coaches Project. MAP stands for Musculoskeletal Athletic Injury Prevention Online Training Course. The idea is that the study will enhance a coach's understanding of injury prevention to muscles, bones, and joints, as well as a coach's motivation to apply what they learn to warm-ups.
It helps to improve intention to implement the warm-up programs, to replace the traditional warm-up with the structured warm-up programs.
Owaye says unpublished preliminary data analysis of the impact of this injury prevention training knowledge suggests a trend towards effectiveness. Showing success, the study is scaling up nationally, and it's recruiting youth coaches in 3 other sports that have a high risk for injury, offering sport-specific training programs.
Help us tackle the problem of neuromuscular deficits in young players because they are not well built for the kind of exposure they're having in sports. So we expect them to play at the level of the NFL because people just want people to hit each other and have fun. You know, the audience wants to have fun. You know, but the truth is these kids are still growing. Injury prevention in youth football, essentially it trains the muscles and the nerves and the brain to communicate efficiently such that they move in the right way. They improve their local tissue strength to be resilient to impact forces when they play sports. But nobody's talking about making this a policy mandate at the national level. My dream is for it to get to the national level, where it becomes a mandate, a policy mandate by federations and associations They have a part of their website that says coaches must do this before they get their license renewed every year or every 2 years. They have something for concussion. They don't have anything for musculoskeletal injuries. Meanwhile, the rate of musculoskeletal injuries is 8 times that of concussion.
Coaches who are interested in participating in this research study may visit the Map for Coaches website, mapforcoaches.net.
Later on Spotlight, inside the life of a sports writer. History Spotlight, brought to you by HEC Media and the Missouri Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell, president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, and this is History Spotlight. Football gained popularity in the late 19th century, but it was a much different game than the one we know today. Public historian Adam Claffey explains how the 1906 St. Louis University football team played a role in this change.
For millions of Americans, every weekend between September and January is about football. But all those people kind of owe a debt of gratitude to a team from St. Louis from the early 20th century that really helped change the way that football is played in America today. So let's back up a little bit. Football starts gaining popularity in the United States in the late 19th century, but it's a much different game than what people today would be expecting. One of the biggest differences is that the only way to advance the ball down the field back then was to run the ball past the line of scrimmage, meaning a running back would take the ball and move it past the line of scrimmage to try to advance the ball downfield. And what that led to was huge scrums of defensive players around that ball carrier trying to take him down. And those scrums could end up being pretty violent. You know, people would be trying to rip the ball away and twist the guy's fingers to get the ball out and everything. And it led to a lot of injuries. But those injuries are more than twisted ankles and stuff. You know, people broke their neck, they broke their back. In 1905 alone, 18 people died playing football in America. It was becoming a huge problem. And there was activists who were advocating that football should be banned because of the violence of the sport. And of course, there were other people that wanted to try to save football, to find a way to change it to make it a little bit safer. One of those people who supported keeping football around was the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt. And in 1905, he calls for a conference at the White House from leading football coaches and strategists and people involved in the game to try to come up with some rule changes that could help save football and preserve it into the future. And one of the rule changes they walk away with is to allow for the forward pass in football, where a quarterback can take the ball and throw it past the line of scrimmage to an eligible receiver downfield to try to gain yardage. And the hope was that this would spread out defenses a little bit, right? So you wouldn't have scrums of people around the line of scrimmage. They'd have to cover eligible receivers. But a lot of critics thought this isn't going to work at all, that the defenders will just bump receivers off their paths, the quarterbacks won't be accurate enough. It just wouldn't be an effective way to run an offensive football. That all changes in September of 1906. That year, in a game on September 5th, St. Louis University quarterback Bradbury Robinson completes the first forward pass in football history. He throws a 20-yard touchdown pass to an eligible receiver named Jack Schneider. And this is not the only forward pass that SLU throws that year. Their entire offense is built around this fast aerial attack, and they're a really good team. They go undefeated in that 1906 season, and even before the season is over, other coaches from around the country are contacting SLU coach Eddie Kochums to try to get some tips from him about how to implement the forward pass into their game. And it completely changes the way that football is played in America today. So for all those millions of people that watch football every weekend in the United States, they kind of owe a debt of gratitude to the St. Louis University team in 1906 that showed just how effective the forward pass could be.
Next week on History Spotlight, discover how Bernie Hayes transformed Black radio in St. Louis through his captivating broadcasts.
To learn more about the Missouri Historical Society, visit mohistory.org.
HEC Media's mission is to strengthen and promote the education, arts, and cultural communities in the St. Louis metropolitan area. By shining a light on big stories bringing change to St. Louis, covering events important to our city, forging community partnerships, and producing award-winning content on the arts, authors, education, culture, and more. It's all at hecmedia.org.
Pulitzer Prize award-winning author Buzz Bissinger is known in St. Louis for his 2009 book, 3 Nights in August, about the baseball Cardinals and then manager Tony La Russa, where the skipper's legendary style of management is explored. And Buzz is best known around the world for being the creator of the work Friday Night Lights, first published in 1990. This storied look at the high school football culture in the town of Odessa, Texas, went on to explore the players, parents, coaches, city dwellers, and the game of football to a wide literary and television audience. When you see the title of his latest work, The Mosquito Bowl, and find out it deals with the real-life football game by Marines on Guadalcanal just before the bloody Battle of Okinawa among former college football players in World War II, you can be forgiven for thinking that this is a book that revolves around the sport of football. But you'd be wrong. Bissinger uses the players and their backgrounds as a lens to tell the story of the lead up to and prosecution of part of the Pacific War until just before the direct assault on the home islands of Japan that took place by the Allies in 1944 and 1945.
I'm interested in the sociological impact of sports, in this case football, the influence that football had, particularly on the Navy in World War II. The Navy felt that football was the single best source of combat training. And because of that, they saved college football. They had officer training programs in which you went to college, you were there for at least a semester, and you were eligible for extracurriculars. So a lot of the men that I wrote about went into that program, played football, and then became Marine officers.
What made you write about that, though? Why'd you pick this subject?
I was looking up sports in World War II, and I saw this thing called the Mosquito Bowl. And you sort of do it, what's the Mosquito Bowl? And then you read, it was played on the island of Guadalcanal. And then you read, it wasn't just a pickup game. The Marines built goalposts, they built a regulation field, they issued programs, they had a PA system that announced the starters. It was broadcast over what they called the Mosquito Radio Network. And it stunned me, because here in the midst of the war, as they waited for the next big battle, was this football game between two regiments that were stocked with some of the greatest college players in the country. College football players tended to gravitate towards the Marines. You had 3 All-Americans, you had 7 captains, and from coast to coast. These players came from coast to coast. And as I kept reading, I said, God, this is incredible. And then I read of the 65 who played, 15 were tragically later killed at Okinawa several months later. It was the last time, particularly for the players, I think, that they were allowed to be boys. But really, right after that, it was back to training, and it was serious training, because they were going to Okinawa, which turned out to be by far the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, and actually one of the bloodiest battles in history. So I said, that's a book, if I can get at it and do the reporting. There's a lot in it. It's about war. It's about a certain type of America that existed in the 1920s and 1930s. There's a part about racism. There's a part about the brutality of our attitudes about immigration. But it's also about young men, I still think of them as boys, serving with duty, without question, serving with honor, willing to sacrifice for our principles of freedom. And so there's tragedy, because I'm portraying many of the 15 who died, but there's uplift, because I think at the end you appreciate and you understand the horror of what they went through. There's a lot of combat in it. You understand the horror of what they went through, but you appreciate it, and you see that in their own way they really were heroes, although they would never. I interviewed veterans from the regiments who were still alive, and if you called them a hero, they would get mad. They would say, I'm not a hero. Do not say that about me. I am not a hero. I did what I had to do.
Watch the full interview at hecmedia.org.
HEC Media, bringing you culture and community. Find all of HEC's positive programming and award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
You can find the stories featured in today's show, along with past episodes and more, at hecmedia.org/spotlight.
Sports plays a significant role in shaping the history of a city, and beat writers are the chroniclers of that history. In St. Louis, writer Jim Thomas covered the journeys of 2 championship teams whose victories unified the entire community. Thomas shares insights into his career as a writer, the principles of excellent journalism, and the unforgettable moments that defined a city.
I can remember as a 10-year-old, I had a make-believe neighborhood newspaper, and I would just write stuff on the paper. I couldn't type then, about the little sports happenings in the neighborhood. In my time as a beat writer with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I covered the '99 Rams, the greatest show on turf, the city's one and only Super Bowl championship, and then exactly 20 years later, I covered the 2019 St. Louis Blues, the one and only championship team in hockey for this city. One story that I wrote that had the biggest impact, and has been mentioned before, is when I broke the news that Stan Kroenke had agreed to buy up to 40% of the Rams, contingent on them moving to St. Louis, and of course they moved to St. Louis. The story ran on Thanksgiving Day of 1994. I remember the mayor at the time, Freeman Bosley, coming on the air and denouncing me, saying that the story wasn't true and it was irresponsible reporting. And obviously it was true. You have to trust your sources. It was a source story. The move itself was fascinating, and just the whole dynamics that went into that. The Rams announced that they were moving in January of '95. They had a big pep rally at the convention center. The very first game up in Green Bay was something I'll never forget. Brett Favre and the Packers were right just on their ascent. The Rams rallied for a victory. A young, unknown wide receiver named Isaac Bruce, he blocked a punt on special teams. And the very next play, he's at wide receiver and he catches a touchdown pass. Favorite memory, I'm sitting in the press box, they're playing Boston, and there was so much demand at TD Garden in Boston for tickets that normally the players that are injured or scratched, they'll sit in a luxury box or a suite. They were right next to us on press row. Robert Thomas was like this far away from me, and when Braden Shen scored to make it 3-0, I remember turning and looking at the players, and they were so excited. You could tell the look in their eyes is, we're gonna win this thing. We're gonna win the Stanley Cup. And they did. I was downtown for the parade and the pep rally under the arch, and it was fantastic. I'll never forget Ryan O'Reilly after the parade, where they were under the arch, said St. Louis is a town of great people, incredible hockey fans, and tremendous drinkers.
Next week, meet some extraordinary Black Missourians, plus how her talent freed her from slavery and earned her a job in the White House. Thanks for watching Spotlight. Join us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. on KPLR 11.